She slid her last dime across the marble counter in 1958, not knowing the drink she ordered would vanish from every drugstore in America within her own lifetime. The soda fountain did not start as a treat at all. It started inside the pharmacy, built to sell carbonated water as a health tonic, and somewhere along the way, a druggist began stirring in flavored syrup just to make the water more pleasant. By the 1930s, that counter had become the center of the American afternoon, the malt shop, the drugstore, the five-and-dime lunch counter. One of these 15 drinks was ordered at a counter that changed the whole country, and we are building up to it. One thing before we go on, and I will not mention it again. Everything I have gathered about keeping a house the old way is written down plain in Clara's 2 little books. The first link below this video will take you to it. If you would like it, it is there. That is all. The ice cream soda is where this whole tradition really begins, and the story traces back to a Philadelphia soda vendor named Robert Green. In October of 1874, at a public fair, Green ran out of the sweet cream he mixed into his soda water. He grabbed a scoop of vanilla ice cream from a neighboring vendor and dropped it in instead. Customers noticed immediately, and within days, druggists up and down the block were copying him, though almost none of them made it the way he actually built it behind the counter. A real ice cream soda was built in a specific order, and a good soda jerk moved fast because another customer was always waiting. Syrup went into the glass first, then a hard shot of carbonated water to dissolve it, then the scoop of ice cream dropped in whole so it would slowly cloud the drink as you drank it, and finally a swirl of whipped cream on top. Get that order wrong and the ice cream just sat in a puddle. And that exact build order is part of why the drink is so hard to find, made properly today. Here is where most people get confused today. A float is soda poured over ice cream that sits at the bottom. A true ice cream soda is layered and stirred as you drink it, syrup and carbonated water first, so the ice cream slowly breaks apart into the fizz instead of just floating on top. That distinction mattered enormously to a soda jerk's reputation, and losing it is part of why the drink quietly disappeared, folded into the simpler float everyone still half remembers. But the counter it was served at did far more than sell dessert. A soda fountain counter was one of the only rooms in a small American town where almost anybody could sit down for the price of a nickel and stay as long as they wanted. A real estate agent, next to a delivery boy, next to a school teacher grading papers between customers. That kind of open seating was rare in a lot of downtowns, and it is part of why so many people remember the counter itself as much as anything they ever ordered there. Building that kind of room took real equipment and a lot more of it than most people picture. Behind the counter sat rows of chrome syrup pumps, a carbonated water tap plumbed straight into the building, a marble slab kept cold for scooping, and a sink deep enough to wash fountain glasses all day without stopping. A soda jerk kept dozens of these pieces moving at once, syrup in one hand, seltzer in the other, timing a scoop so it did not melt before the glass reached the counter. It looked effortless from the customer's side of the marble, and that illusion of effortlessness is exactly what made the cheapest drink on the whole menu feel like a little bit of theater. None of that equipment was cheap to install either, and a small-town druggist deciding to put in a full soda fountain was making a real financial bet on his own storefront, not just adding a side item. He was betting that the marble counter, the chrome pumps, and the daily deliveries of fresh ice cream would pull in more customers than they cost to maintain, month after month, year after year. Most druggists guessed right for a very long stretch of the 20th century, and that long stretch of being right is exactly why nobody saw the ending coming. The cheapest drink on the menu, and the one that has vanished the most completely, came out of Brooklyn, and it has neither egg nor cream in it despite the name. It was built from whole milk, seltzer, and chocolate syrup, and it cost pennies at a candy store counter for decades. A candy store owner named Louis Oster is the name most often credited with popularizing it, somewhere around the 1890s or early 1900s. Nobody can even fully agree on why it is called what it is called, which makes it one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in all of American food history. The recipe was never written down, but every soda jerk on that block knew it by heart, the exact angle to hold the seltzer siphon, the exact splash of syrup before the milk went in. Getting it wrong meant a flat, chalky glass that no regular would ever order twice. Getting it right meant a head of foam that held for a full minute, which regulars judge the same way people today judge the crema on an espresso. And regulars noticed everything, because for a lot of these kids, the candy store was the only place in the neighborhood that was truly theirs. Part of why so many families claimed that candy store was that it stayed affordable no matter how tight things got. During the hardest years of the Depression, a few pennies still bought a full glass, so a father who could not afford much of anything else could still hand his kid a nickel and call it a treat. That affordability is a quiet thread running through most of this list. Drinks built cheap enough that a family stretching very little could still make room for one. It is also part of why nobody ever felt the need to write the recipe down. One theory holds that egg cream is a slight corruption of a French or Yiddish phrase for chocolate and cream, worn down over generations of shopkeepers and customers, speaking multiple languages at once in the same crowded store. Another theory claims the foam on top simply looked like beaten egg whites to somebody, and the name just stuck from there. Nobody has ever proven either version, and food historians treat it as a genuine open question rather than a settled fact. That kind of unresolved mystery is rare in food history, and it is part of what makes this particular drink so beloved. That beloved little mystery, remarkably, never really left New York, spreading the way a lot of neighborhood food does, through kids who moved, through cousins who opened their own shops, through families who carried a taste with them from one Brooklyn block to the Lower East Side and up into the Bronx. There was no company selling it, no franchise, no advertising campaign, just word of mouth carrying a two-ingredient drink across an entire city for decades. It survived that way for close to a century without ever needing a marketing department at all, which is part of why so few people outside New York have ever tasted a proper one. Most modern attempts get the ratio wrong. Too much syrup, not enough seltzer pressure, and what comes out barely resembles the drink a Brooklyn kid would have recognized in 1935. The real version depends on equipment almost nobody keeps in a home kitchen anymore. A much bigger drink was about to spread the opposite way, from one small Pennsylvania pharmacy out to nearly every counter in the country. That drink came from a 23-year-old apprentice pharmacist named David Strickler, working the soda fountain at Tassel's Pharmacy in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. In 1904, he wanted to build something that made a statement, not just a scoop in a bowl. He split a banana lengthwise, laid it in a long dish he had specifically designed for the purpose, and set 3 scoops of ice cream in the middle with syrup and toppings on top. He was not the pharmacy owner. He was barely more than a kid, and he had just designed one of the most famous desserts in American history. The dish itself was the innovation, that long boat-shaped plate, built specifically to hold a split banana rather than a round bowl, and it is still the shape people picture the second you say the words, banana split. It was priced at 10 cents when a regular sundae ran about half that, which made ordering one a small act of showing off, especially for a teenager trying to impress somebody sitting across the counter. That showing off did not stay contained to one small Pennsylvania town for very long at all. Latrobe still holds an annual celebration built entirely around this one dessert, more than a century later, drawing visitors specifically to the town where Strickler once stood behind that counter. That is a striking contrast to the egg cream, which stayed almost stubbornly local to New York for generations. The banana split did the opposite, copied and reinvented in drugstore after drugstore across the entire country, long before anyone thought to call it a franchise. A different drink was about to become an even bigger national craze, one built around a powder instead of a banana. Unlike the banana split, that drink did not start out as a treat. It started as medicine. Malted milk was patented back in 1873 by William Horlick as a dried food specifically meant for infants and invalids, made from malted barley and wheat mixed with milk, sold in pharmacies as something closer to a health supplement than a dessert. For roughly half a century, it stayed exactly that, a sickroom product, nothing anyone would have called indulgent. Then somebody behind a soda fountain looked at that same powder and saw a completely different opportunity. That person was a Chicago Walgreens fountain worker named Ivar Coulson, known to everyone as Pop, who around 1922 started stirring 2 scoops of vanilla ice cream into a standard malted milk drink instead of serving it plain. Within a few years, malted milkshakes were on fountain menus from coast to coast, and the malt shop as a whole idea, the phrase people still use for a nostalgic soda counter, essentially grew up around this one drink. What that same drink did to Walgreens as a company is easy to overlook, but the numbers behind it tell their own story. It required specific equipment, too, a spindle mixer that whipped the malt powder, milk, syrup, and ice cream into something thick enough to need a straw with real backbone, and a soda jerk who knew exactly how long to run the machine before the shake turned grainy instead of smooth. That was not a skill a store could hire off the street without training, and training took time a busy fountain rarely had to spare during a lunchtime rush. Getting it right was worth the trouble because of just how much ice cream a single popular drink could move. For decades, industry accounts describe Walgreens as one of the single largest buyers of ice cream and syrup in the entire country, built almost entirely off the strength of that one malted shake and the crowds it pulled through the door. The fountain was never really the business, it was the bait, and the malted milkshake, with its theater and its machinery, was the single best bait a pharmacist could buy. That is exactly why, decades later, when real estate got expensive and shelf space got more profitable than a staffed counter, the malted milkshake was one of the first things a chain drugstore quietly cut. That business logic explains most of what disappeared from these counters, but it does not explain the color of the next one. In Chicago in 1919, a soda maker created a bright green fruit-flavored drink that looked like almost nothing else on the menu, unmistakable the moment it hit the glass. It became a signature order across the Midwest for decades, the kind of drink a kid would ask for by color before they even knew what flavor it actually was. It had a name that sounded more like a place than a drink. That drink was Green River. And even people who grew up drinking it constantly struggled to describe exactly what it tasted like. Something citrus, something almost like an unusually sweet lime, and something else nobody could quite pin down. That flavor mystery became part of the appeal rather than a flaw, a drink kids ordered as much out of loyalty to the color and the name as any specific craving. It stayed a genuine regional star through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and into the 1950s, especially across the Midwest, where being from a Green River town was practically a point of local identity. That local identity ran deep enough that some Midwest counties treated their Green River loyalty the way other places treat a favorite local team, a drink you defended at a county fair against out-of-towners who had never even heard of it. That kind of fierce regional pride never had the marketing budget of the national soda companies behind it, and that turned out to matter enormously once those companies started fighting for shelf space in the new self-service supermarkets springing up outside of town. Without that marketing budget, Green River simply could not compete once bottled soda moved off the fountain counter and onto a supermarket shelf where a national brand's advertising did all the selling before a customer ever touched the bottle. By the 1970s and 80s, it had faded from most menus entirely, hanging on today mostly as a novelty bottled soda a few nostalgic drinkers still track down on purpose. What replaced it on most menus was not another color at all. It was a tart little drink built from a food-grade acid nobody would recognize by name today. It has not disappeared entirely, though. A small wave of home soda makers and craft syrup producers has quietly brought renewed attention to old fountain flavors in recent years, Green River included, chasing down the exact shade of green and the elusive flavor nobody could ever fully describe. It is a small, niche revival, nothing close to the drink's old nationwide reach, but it means a curious grandchild today can still track down a bottle if they know exactly where to look. That same small revival has quietly reached back for one more forgotten category, too. That category is the phosphate, made from flavored syrup, carbonated water, and just a few drops of acid phosphate, a food-grade additive that gave the drink a sharp, tangy bite instead of pure sweetness. Cherry phosphate and lime phosphate were the two you heard ordered most, and from the 1870s all the way through the 1950s, they were about as ordinary a request as a fountain soda is now. Almost nobody under 60 has ever tasted one, and almost nobody under 40 has ever heard the word used this way at all. What makes the phosphate's disappearance so strange is that it was never exotic to begin with. It was the plainest, most everyday order on the whole menu, the fountain equivalent of asking for a soda today, not a specialty drink anyone treated as unusual. It vanished almost completely from public memory anyway, not because people stopped liking tart drinks, but because acid phosphate itself stopped being something a corner drugstore kept in stock once the fountain business dried up around it. That same tartness is exactly what a handful of craft soda makers are chasing again today. A handful of small nostalgia soda shops and independent syrup makers now advertise phosphate specifically as a forgotten classic, using the exact same food-grade acid a druggist would have kept behind the counter a century ago. It is a niche interest, not a mass-market comeback, but it means the flavor is not entirely gone, just hard to find without knowing exactly which door to walk through. That same tartness was also what made a Lime Ricky work, though this one had a slightly rougher origin than a pharmacy counter. The Lime Ricky has genuine roots in Washington, D.C. bar culture in the 1880s and 90s, built from soda water, lime juice, and a plain, simple syrup. Its bar cousin sometimes carried a splash of gin, but the version that made it onto pharmacy soda fountains nationwide was always the plain, non-alcoholic kind, sharp and refreshing rather than sweet. By the early 1900s, that fountain version had become a standard order across the entire country, and it stayed popular clear through the 1950s. Did you ever order a Lime Ricky at a fountain or restaurant? Tell me about it in the comments. Its name traveled a lot further than most people ever realized. It traveled because drugstore chains, magazines, and traveling salesmen all carried fountain recipes with them from city to city, the way a song spreads before radio even existed. A Lime Ricky ordered in a small Ohio town in 1935 used almost the same ratio as one ordered in a Washington, D.C. bar decades earlier, passed along counter to counter with nothing written down beyond a soda jerk's memory. That same word-of-mouth system built one more category of drink, the kind kids ordered specifically to be a little bit reckless without breaking a single rule. A Lime Ricky drew two very different crowds to the same counter. During the lunch hour, it was a working man's order, a quick, sharp, refreshing drink grabbed between shifts at a factory or an office desk. In the evening, the same glass belonged to teenagers stretching out an hour on a date, nursing it slowly because a second one meant another whole nickel. The counter did not care which crowd it was serving, and that flexibility is part of why the drink lasted as long as it did. That drink was called a suicide, sometimes a graveyard, built by pumping a little of every syrup on the counter into one glass, cherry, chocolate, lime, root beer, cola, all of it at once, then topping it with carbonated water. No pharmacist invented it, and no fountain ever advertised it. It was strictly a teenager's dare, ordered to prove you could drink the whole ugly mess without making a face. but the name itself changed completely depending on which town you were standing in. The name changed depending entirely on which town you grew up in. Suicide in some places, graveyard in others, and a handful of counters called it something rougher still that a soda jerk would only say with a grin once the parents in line had moved along. None of these names ever appeared on a printed menu because the drink itself was never officially for sale, just something a jerk would build if you asked for it by the right nickname. That kind of unofficial word-of-mouth menu turned out to be exactly how a whole generation defined itself at the counter. That teenage takeover was tied directly to the rise of the car in the 1950s, when a driver's license meant real freedom for the first time, and a malt shop with a jukebox became the obvious destination for it. Early rock and roll played on those jukeboxes while car hops and counter regulars mixed together in a way that felt entirely new to parents who had grown up ordering their own phosphate quietly at the same kind of counter decades earlier. It is the single most photographed version of the soda fountain, and also, in many ways, its very last chapter. Did your family have a counter or a corner shop like that, somewhere everybody knew your usual order the second you walked in the door? I would love to hear about it in the comments, because that kind of memory is exactly what this whole video is trying to hold on to. It was that familiarity, more than any single drink, that made a soda fountain feel like a second living room. And remember, one of these 15 drinks was ordered at a counter that changed the whole country. We are getting closer to it now. That daring, playful side of the fountain existed right alongside something much quieter and more respectable. The simple float, built from root beer poured over a scoop of vanilla ice cream. Regionally, this drink caused genuine confusion. In some parts of the country, a root beer float was called a black cow, and in others, that same name belonged to a chocolate soda with ice cream in it, while brown cow meant the opposite, depending entirely on which town you grew up in. Nobody standardized it, and nobody ever really agreed on whose grandmother had it right. That disagreement usually became a piece of household folklore rather than a real argument, one family insisting their black cow was the correct black cow, and treating a neighbor's opposite version as a strange local mistake rather than an equally valid tradition. Grandmothers passed the name down exactly the way they passed down the drink itself, with total confidence and zero documentation, which is how so much fountain history survived at all without ever being written into a single official cookbook. That kind of local disagreement was common across fountain culture more broadly. There was never a national rulebook, just thousands of independent counters, each developing their own small local dialect of the same basic drinks. A float ordered in Detroit might carry an entirely different name than the same drink ordered 2 states over, and both counters would insist their version was the original. That local pride is part of why Detroit held on to one float so tightly that it still names it after their own hometown ginger ale instead of anyone else's. That drink is the Boston Cooler, and despite the name, it has almost nothing to do with Boston at all. It is a Detroit specialty, built from Verner's Ginger Ale, a distinctly spicy Detroit-made ginger ale first sold sometime in the 1860s or 1870s, poured directly over vanilla ice cream. Detroit fountains served it for generations as a point of genuine local pride. It remains one of the very few drinks on this list that a handful of Michigan restaurants still proudly serve by its original name. Part of that survival comes down to sheer stubbornness. Verner's itself carries a sharper, spicier bite than most national ginger ales, something people who grew up outside Michigan often find genuinely surprising the first time they try it, and Detroit families defend that specific bite the way other cities defend a local pizza style or a local barbecue sauce. A drink tied that tightly to civic identity is much harder to erase than one that was purely interchangeable with a dozen other regional sodas. Most drinks on this list never had that kind of built-in loyalty working in their favor. It is worth noticing the contrast here. The malted milkshake spread from one Chicago Walgreens to nearly every counter in the country within a few short years, while the Boston Cooler stayed almost entirely within Michigan for its whole existence, content to be a hometown drink rather than a national one. Neither path guaranteed survival on its own, since the malted shake still faded once fountains closed everywhere, and the Boston Cooler only held on because Detroit refused to let go of it. Loyalty, it turns out, mattered more in the end than reach ever did. Without that loyalty, most fountain drinks depended entirely on the counters that served them, and those counters existed in the first place, partly because of a national law that had nothing to do with dessert at all. When Prohibition began in 1920, banning the legal sale of alcohol nationwide, a great many bars simply converted directly into soda fountains rather than close their doors, keeping the same marble counters and bar stools and swapping whiskey for flavored syrup. That single legal change reshaped the entire American drugstore business almost overnight. It reshaped it in an even stranger way, too. During Prohibition, pharmacies could still legally sell liquor by medical prescription, which meant the prescription counter and the soda fountain counter often sat only a few feet apart in the very same drugstore. A customer might fill a doctor's prescription on one side of the room and order a phosphate on the other, both handled by the same pharmacist behind the same marble surface. That strange overlap is part of why drugstores became such central social hubs through the 1920s, long before the Golden Age most people picture even began. Rexall drugstores understood that centrality better than almost anyone, and in 1929, the chain ran a famous nationwide promotion where buying one item let a customer purchase a second one for a single penny, drawing enormous crowds into stores across the entire country. The Cherry Smash, a simple crushed cherry syrup soda, rode that promotional wave hard, poured cold and fast for customers who had just walked in off a sale line. It was one of the most recognizable fountain drinks of its decade, purely because of how well it fit a crowd. That same simplicity, though, meant the Cherry Smash had almost nothing distinctive to keep it alive once the crowds and the sale events stopped coming. It was easy to make in bulk, which made it perfect for a promotional day. But a drink built purely for speed rarely earns the kind of personal loyalty that keeps something alive for a century. It faded out quietly, without ever really being replaced by anything with its exact same character, and a far more theatrical drink filled the space it left behind on the menu board. The Cherry Smash was far from the only drink built for a sale day rather than a slow afternoon regular. Fountains kept a whole tier of fast, cheap, crowd-friendly drinks in reserve, specifically for busy promotional events, syrup and soda water combinations that a jerk could pour in seconds without needing ice cream or a scoop at all. Those crowd drinks rarely got the same affection as the ones people ordered on an ordinary Tuesday, and almost none of them survived past the era of the sales that made them popular in the first place. That drink was the Purple Cow, built from grape syrup, carbonated water, and a scoop of vanilla ice cream, named for the vivid violet color it turned the moment the ice cream hit the fizz. Kids ordered it as much for the color as the flavor, and a good soda jerk knew exactly how to build it slowly enough that the purple swirled dramatically instead of just muddying into the glass all at once. It was showmanship as much as it was a recipe, and a soda jerk who could not perform that swirl properly lost the tip. That showmanship, the swirl, the pour, the little flourish of setting a cherry exactly in the center, was the entire job description of a soda jerk. And losing skilled jerks is a bigger part of the decline story than most people realize. As fountains closed, the specific hand skill of building these drinks quickly and beautifully simply stopped being taught, because there was nowhere left to practice it and nobody left willing to pay to learn it. A skill that took years to build vanished within a single generation once the training ground disappeared. Even the way a soda jerk looked was part of that vanished training. The crisp white paper hat, the striped apron, the bow tie kept straight through an entire shift of leaning over ice and syrup. It was a uniform, built for a very specific kind of performance, part waiter, part bartender, part small stage magician, and it signaled to every customer walking in that whoever stood behind that marble counter took the job seriously. Once the uniform disappeared from American storefronts, an entire visual shorthand for hospitality disappeared right along with it. That vanished showmanship is exactly what a good tin roof sundae depended on: vanilla ice cream, chocolate syrup, and a scattering of salted Spanish peanuts on top, the salt cutting straight through all that sweetness in a way that surprised first-time customers every single time. It was one of the cheaper sundaes on most fountain menus, which made it the everyday order rather than the special occasion one, ordered by regulars who wanted something satisfying without spending banana split money. And it disappeared for a reason that has almost nothing to do with taste at all. The real reason is simply that salted Spanish peanuts stopped being a routine fountain supply item once the fountain supply chain itself collapsed alongside the counters it served. A drugstore that no longer stocked a full ice cream and syrup operation had no reason to keep specialty toppings on hand either, and once a sundae depended on an ingredient the store no longer carried, it simply stopped appearing on the menu board at all. Small supply decisions like that quietly erased dozens of once common treats, one ingredient at a time. A modern sundae bar leans on caramel, crushed cookies, and candy pieces, all sweetness stacked on sweetness with nothing to interrupt it. The tin roof took the opposite approach, letting a handful of plain salted peanuts do all the work of interrupting that sweetness on purpose. It was a simpler, more restrained kind of sundae than what most people order today, built around one sharp contrast instead of a pile of toppings. That restraint is easy to overlook now, but it was exactly the kind of small, deliberate choice that separated a great soda jerk from an average one. Up in New England, a slightly different word for a similar idea survived that collapse a little longer than most: the frap, which is simply a thick milkshake blended with real ice cream rather than just flavored milk. Ask for a milkshake in parts of Massachusetts or Rhode Island even now, and you might just get flavored milk with no ice cream in it at all. Because the frappa was always the word locals reserved specifically for the thick version with real scoops blended in. That regional split confused plenty of travelers over the decades. A visitor from out of state confidently ordering a milkshake in a Boston area diner and getting a thin glass of flavored milk with a puzzled look from the counter attendant when they asked where the ice cream had gone. Locals found the confusion mildly amusing rather than annoying, a small point of regional pride disguised as a misunderstanding. That kind of stubborn local vocabulary is part of why New England fountain culture lingered a little later than the national average before finally fading too. A frap took real ice cream, real machinery, and a soda jerk who actually knew the difference between a thin shake and a proper thick one. And as those staffed counters closed across the region through the 1970s and 80s, even that small pocket of resistance eventually gave way to self-service and packaged convenience like everywhere else. But before all of that closing and fading, there was one order simpler than every single drink on this list, sold for pennies and known everywhere in one particular neighborhood by exactly the same plain name. Part of why the frappe lasted a little longer than most fountain drinks comes down to ownership. A lot of New England drugstores and diners stayed in the same family for generations, instead of getting absorbed into a national chain, and an owner serving his own grandfather's regulars had far less incentive to rip out a working soda fountain than a chain manager answering to a spreadsheet somewhere else entirely. That same pattern of small, stubbornly independent ownership shows up again and again in every drink on this list that managed to survive even a little while longer than the rest. That order was a plain glass of seltzer with nothing added, sold in Brooklyn and the Lower East Side for 2 cents, and known by exactly that name: 2 cents plain. It was not even really a fountain drink at all, because half the time you never had to leave your own apartment to get one, and that alone made it one of the strangest and most personal items on this entire list. The reason nobody had to leave home for it comes down to one particular delivery job that no longer really exists. That job belonged to a familiar figure called the Seltzer Man, who delivered pressurized glass seltzer bottles door to door in a wire carrier, the way a milkman delivered milk, and picked up the empties for refill on his next visit. It ran like a subscription service decades before anyone used that word for anything, a genuine ongoing relationship between a family and the person who kept their seltzer stocked, week after week, year after year. The bottles themselves were built to be used again and again, which was simply how things worked back then. Every seltzer bottle a family used got picked up, cleaned, refilled with fresh pressurized water, and delivered right back out again, a full loop that ran for decades before anyone thought to describe it as sustainable or efficient, because it was simply the only practical way to run the business. That same wire carrier system, remarkably, survived far longer than almost anything else on this list, shrinking slowly but still running in a handful of New York neighborhoods into the 1970s and even the early 1980s, long after most drugstore fountains had already closed for good. Those seltzer bottles were built to last. Thick patterned glass with a metal pressure head and a small lever spout, heavy enough that a full case made a real workout out of a delivery route. Families kept the same bottles in rotation for years, refilled again and again by the same seltzer works that first sold them, which meant a single well-made bottle might outlive several presidents before it ever cracked. That kind of built to last, built to be reused thinking feels almost foreign now, and it is part of why this whole delivery system is so hard to picture without seeing it firsthand. It survived because it was never dependent on a pharmacy's real estate decisions in the first place, just a driver, a truck, and a route of loyal customers. And that same counterculture, the candy store, the Seltzer Man's regular stops, the neighborhood drugstore, was about to intersect with something far bigger than any single drink on this list in a town nowhere near New York at all. That something bigger happened in Greensboro, North Carolina, on February 1st, 1960, at a Woolworth's five-and-dime lunch counter with its own soda fountain service. 4 black college students, Ezell Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, sat down at the whites' only counter and were refused service, and they simply did not leave. Within weeks, their quiet refusal to move had spread to lunch counters in dozens of cities across the American South. That is the counter we have been building toward this whole video, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it. A soda fountain counter, the exact same kind of place where somebody ordered a purple cow or a cherry smash on any ordinary afternoon, became one of the most consequential settings in the entire American civil rights movement. That site was not simply left behind once the sit-ins ended either. The original Greensboro Woolworth's building is preserved today as a civil rights museum, its lunch counter kept intact specifically so visitors can stand exactly where those 4 students sat, understanding the moment in physical space rather than only in a history book. Very few soda fountain counters anywhere in the country received that kind of deliberate, permanent preservation, which says everything about how differently this one afternoon is remembered compared to any drink on this list. It is a reminder that these counters were never just about dessert, not even close. Once you know that, every drink on this list looks a little different, because a soda fountain was never really about the syrup or the ice cream at all. It was about who got to sit down, who got served, who got to belong in that particular room on a particular afternoon. 15 drinks disappeared largely because of shelf space and real estate math, but the counters themselves disappeared from public life for reasons that reach far beyond profit margins, into the deeper story of who these spaces were actually built to include. The Greensboro sit-in did not stay contained to one Woolworth's either. Within that same year, similar quiet protests spread to soda fountain counters, lunchrooms, and public facilities across dozens of towns in the American South, each one following the same basic pattern of sitting down, asking to be served, and simply staying put. A counter built to sell a 5-cent cherry smash became, almost overnight, one of the most ordinary and most powerful stages for change in the entire country. That shift in what these rooms represented happened faster than almost anyone expected. By the time most fountains finally closed in the 1970s and 80s, the culture around them had already changed enormously from where it started, more open, more integrated, more reflective of the country it was actually serving. What closed was a business model that could no longer compete with a shelf of packaged snacks, not the deeper idea of a shared counter itself. That idea did not just move to other businesses, it left one very specific reminder behind for anyone willing to look for it. So when you line up all 15 of these drinks side by side, the ice cream soda, the egg cream, the banana split, the malted milkshake, Green River, the phosphate, the lime Ricky, the suicide, the black cow, the Boston cooler, the cherry smash, the purple cow, the tin roof sundae, the frap, and 2 cents plain, you are really looking at a map of an entire vanished economy, one built on trained hands, cheap real estate, and a counter everybody in town could walk up to. Interest in that vanished economy has been quietly building back up in recent years, with old recipes and forgotten food traditions drawing real attention from people rediscovering them for the first time alongside those who remember them firsthand. A handful of multi-generational family-run pharmacies still keep a working soda fountain running today, treated locally as living museums rather than ordinary businesses. And travel writers occasionally rediscover them all over again. None of that adds up to the old economy coming back, but it does mean the story is not entirely finished yet. Most of what kept these drinks alive as long as they lasted was never a company or an institution at all. It was one person deciding a recipe was worth remembering and passing it to somebody else before it slipped away entirely. That same small act is really all it takes to keep any of this from disappearing completely. A grandmother describing exactly how her father's counter built a phosphate, a grandson writing it down for the first time 50 years later. Preserving it was never complicated. It just required somebody willing to pay attention. None of that economy needed to be glamorous to matter. It ran on a druggist willing to install a marble counter he did not strictly need, on a teenager willing to learn a swirl technique nobody wrote down, on a Seltzer Man willing to climb 4 flights of tenement stairs every single week without fail. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and that photograph in the family box is only the beginning of what still needs tracking down before it disappears for good. If any of these 15 sound familiar to you, if your own grandmother had a name for one that we did not use here, that is exactly the kind of detail worth keeping alive, because so much of this history was never written down anywhere official at all. It lived in hands, in habits, in the specific way one particular soda jerk built one particular drink in one particular town. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and every single detail you remember is one more piece of it that does not get lost. So the next time you pass an old drugstore building downtown, the kind with a long faded sign or a marble threshold worn smooth by decades of footsteps, take a second look at it. Somewhere behind that door there was probably a counter, a row of stools, a soda jerk who knew everybody's order, and 15 drinks like the ones we just walked through, most of them gone now, all of them worth remembering on their own terms. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you at the next counter.